Elric Moreau was the kind of man who could cry on cue, charm a room with a single glance, and slip into any role as if born for the stage. But when his wife, Naela Moreau, was found murdered in their quiet suburban home, detectives began to wonder, was his greatest performance the one where he played the grieving husband? Elric Moreau had always known how to draw a crowd. Tall, sharply dressed, and effortlessly charismatic, he carried himself with the presence of someone meant to be on stage. Years ago, he had set his sights on Broadway, convinced that his intense performances and expressive features would earn him standing ovations and critical acclaim. But the lights of New York never quite found him. His career stalled in small-town productions, regional festivals, and the occasional commercial gig. Still, Elric never let go of his flair for the dramatic. Every gesture, every sentence seemed carefully delivered, as if he were always performing. He met Naela during a library fundraiser where he was acting in a one-man play about Edgar Allan Poe. She was running the book table, while Elric stole the show with haunting monologues and stormy stares. Naela quietly sold rare poetry books and offered quiet smiles to guests. She was soft-spoken, intelligent, and self-contained, a quiet contrast to his theatrical world. To everyone's surprise, the two were drawn to each other quickly. They married less than a year later in a small ceremony behind her vintage bookstore, where she walked down an aisle made of first editions and lit candles. To their friends and neighbors in Aldrich Falls, they were the image of an ideal couple. Naela ran Fox and Quill, a charming old-world bookstore that had become something of a community landmark. It smelled of leather and tea, with creaky floors and handwritten signs. She hosted weekly poetry nights and author readings, while Elric hosted open mic nights in the back room, reading dramatic soliloquies to small but loyal crowds. Online, their lives looked idyllic. Filtered photos of beach sunsets, slow dancing in the kitchen, handwritten love notes in coffee mugs. They celebrated every anniversary with a photo shoot, and every birthday with a dramatic themed party. People loved them. People envied them, but what no one saw were the cracks beneath the glossy surface. Over time, Naela began pulling away from the spotlight that Elric loved so much. She stopped appearing at his theater events and stopped posting about him online. When asked, she would simply smile and say she was busy with the store. Friends noticed her energy changing. Her normally serene demeanor had a new heaviness, something quieter than sadness but deeper than stress. She spent more time with her sister Vera and less time at home. Elric, meanwhile, insisted everything was fine. Always smiling, always telling stories, always the center of attention. In the spring of 2023, tragedy struck. One rainy April evening, Elric called 911, his voice frantic and trembling. He claimed he had returned home from rehearsal to find Naela lifeless on the floor of their living room, a single stab wound in her chest, surrounded by blood. He said the front door was unlocked. He said it looked like someone had broken in. By the time paramedics arrived, Naela was already gone. News of her death shocked the town. Candlelight vigils were held outside the bookstore. Flowers and handwritten notes piled up near the shop's windows. Elric gave a heartfelt statement the next day, fighting back tears as he thanked the community for their support. He spoke of Naela's kindness, her brilliance, her love of books and quiet mornings. People wept with him. His grief seemed real. His heartbreak seemed unbearable. But for the detectives assigned to the case, something about the scene didn't feel right. Nothing in the house was missing. There were no broken windows, no forced locks, no overturned furniture. Naela's purse sat on the couch, untouched. Her jewelry was still in its box. A half-drunk cup of tea sat cooling beside her open laptop, where she'd been working on invoices just minutes before she died. As the investigation began, quiet whispers emerged in town, questions no one wanted to ask out loud. If there was no robbery, no forced entry, and no motive for anyone else to hurt her, then who had the most to gain from Naela Moreau's death? And could the man who had once played Hamlet with such emotional depth be hiding something far more sinister behind his stage-ready grief? The initial response to Naela Moreau's death was one of disbelief. It was hard to imagine such horror unfolding inside the cozy, book-filled home that had once been the backdrop of so many joyful moments. Neighbors recalled hearing no screams, no unusual sounds that night, just the distant hum of rain and the occasional car passing through the quiet streets of Aldridge Falls. But as investigators examined the crime scene, the picture painted by Elric's 911 call began to blur. The poor house was untouched. There were no broken locks, no shattered windows, no signs that someone had entered by force. Every valuable item, from electronics to jewelry to cash, remained exactly where it had always been. Naela's phone was on the kitchen counter. Her laptop was open on the coffee table, an invoice halfway typed. There was even a scented candle burning, nearly melted down, filling the room with the soft scent of lavender. It looked less like a crime scene and more like someone had simply paused their evening and never returned to it. Elric told police he had come home after rehearsal. Around 10:45 p.m., he said he noticed the front door slightly ajar, which immediately set off alarms in his mind. He claimed to have stepped inside and found Naela lying in the middle of the living room, unresponsive and covered in blood. He called 911 within minutes, his voice choked with emotion. He insisted he had nothing to hide and even voluntarily gave his phone to investigators to verify his timeline, but the details he offered began to raise eyebrows. Elric said he had gone to rehearsal at the local theater company at 7 p.m., stayed for a few hours, and then grabbed coffee at a downtown cafe before heading home. When detectives checked security footage at the theater, Elric was indeed seen entering, but only briefly, around 7:20 p.m. He stayed for less than 15 minutes, said very little to anyone, and left without explanation. When they pulled surveillance footage from the coffee shop, things got stranger. Elric claimed he had sat inside for nearly an hour, nursing a cappuccino and reading over his script, but the footage never showed him enter the building. No transaction was recorded under his name. The baristas didn't recall seeing him that night. A traffic camera near the cafe showed his car pass by, but it never stopped. Instead, footage from a different street, closer to his neighborhood, showed Elric's vehicle circling the block just before 9:00 p.m., more than an hour before, the time he claimed to have arrived home. GPS data from his phone confirmed this. For reasons he wouldn't explain, Elric had been near his home, and possibly inside it, long before he called 911. The inconsistencies turned suspicion into something more. When asked to clarify, Elric became defensive. He blamed the theater director for poor memory. He claimed the coffee shop had probably erased footage by mistake. He even suggested that he had driven around the neighborhood for a while, thinking through a difficult scene in his upcoming play. But his explanation sounded rehearsed, too precise, too perfect. Every answer felt like it had been crafted in advance, as though he'd anticipated each question long before it was asked. Meanwhile, the autopsy report narrowed the time of death to between 8:30 and 9:15 p.m. The wound was clean, deliberate, a single stab to the chest that punctured Naela's heart. There were no defensive wounds on her body, no scratches, no bruises, nothing to suggest a struggle had taken place. It was sudden, silent. Detectives began to wonder if Naela had ever seen it coming. The town that once rallied around Elric began to fall silent. People who had hugged him at the vigil now looked away at the grocery store. Behind the scenes, the investigation intensified. Forensics combed every inch of the Moreau home, searching for the murder weapon. Canine units scoured the yard and nearby storm drains. Nothing turned up, yet the absence of evidence did not bring comfort. It only made the entire scene feel colder, more calculated. If someone had committed this murder with such control, such quiet precision, then it wasn't just a crime of passion. It was something planned, something deliberate, and suspicion kept circling back to the man who had spent his entire life pretending to be someone else. 3 weeks after Naela's funeral, the investigation took a sharp, unexpected turn. Until that point, police had been circling around circumstantial evidence, hoping for a break, a clue, a mistake, a confession. But what they found instead was a script, a literal one. The discovery came from an anonymous tip. A man, whose identity was never revealed, contacted the Aldridge Falls Police Department and claimed to have seen Elric Moreau visiting an old, shuttered theater warehouse, late at night just days before his wife's death. The building had once housed the Aldridge Experimental Players, a local acting troupe that disbanded after a fire gutted the interior. It had been closed for years, collecting dust, memories, and in this case, secrets. Investigators obtained a warrant and entered the building. Among the charred beams and decaying props, they found a trunk tucked beneath a fallen backdrop. Inside were old costumes, some yellowed scripts, and a thick, leather-bound notebook. It wasn't labeled with Elric's name, but his handwriting was unmistakable. Bold, slanted, and overly dramatic, like a signature demanding attention. The notebook appeared, at first, to be a collection of creative writing exercises. There were stage notes, character monologues, and short scenes written in script format. But as detectives flipped through the pages, the tone shifted. Around the halfway mark, they came across a section titled Project Lament. It was a script, not for a play, not for a film, but a chilling recreation of the night Naela died. The script followed a character eerily similar to Elric, an out-of-work actor with a troubled marriage who discovers his wife dead in the living room. It included the exact lines Elric used during his 911 call, word for word. The phrases he repeated to the media, the emotional beats he hit during interviews, all of them were written out in advance. Stage directions included cues like pause before tears, stare into distance, and choke voice at line. She was everything to me. One page was even more disturbing. It contained alternate endings to the script, each one testing a different emotional angle: anger, despair, confusion. It was as if Elric had rehearsed every possible way to grieve, trying to decide which would appear most convincing to the world. Detectives referred to it as a performance manual for deception. Then came the checklist. Scrawled in red ink on a loose page, the list was titled Believability. The points were brief but telling. Practice cry in mirror, wear wrinkled. Clothes for realism. Pause before entering house. Don't be the one to suggest robbery. Let them reach that. This was no story. It was a blueprint. Detectives also noted something else, a timeline scribbled in the margins of several pages. It started with, leave house at 7:20, and ended with call 911 by 10:50. The window of time matched the very gap that had raised suspicions earlier in the investigation. With this new evidence, the case against Elric Moreau shifted from suspicion to probable cause. Prosecutors now had a document that not only contradicted his alibi, but suggested premeditation. They believed Elric had used the abandoned theater as a planning ground, a space where he could rehearse the most important role of his life, a grieving husband. The notebook was submitted as evidence, along with forensic tests that confirmed Elric's fingerprints on nearly every page. Experts in behavioral analysis reviewed the document and agreed. It was not an innocent creative project. It showed awareness, planning, and a chilling detachment from reality. Elric didn't just want to get away with murder. He wanted to be admired for how convincingly he suffered. This revelation shocked even the most seasoned detectives. In their years of experience, they had seen many criminals try to cover their tracks. But never had they encountered someone who had literally scripted their lies like a stage play. With the discovery of the script, investigators began to revisit every detail of Elric Moreau's life with renewed focus. Now convinced that Naela's murder had been carefully planned rather than impulsive, they turned their attention to motive. What could have driven a man so publicly devoted to his wife to commit such a cold, calculated act? The answer began to emerge through the tangled web of Elric's personal finances, professional failures, and a quiet, growing desperation that he had worked hard to keep hidden. While Elric had always presented himself as a successful, if underappreciated, actor, the reality was much darker. Over the past 5 years, he had sunk thousands of dollars into failed theater productions and self-funded film projects that never made it past post-production. He borrowed money from friends, took out personal loans, and maxed out credit cards in pursuit of artistic recognition that never came. At one point, he even tried launching a one-man web series, which gained little traction beyond a small group of theater enthusiasts. The praise he once received for his intensity on stage had faded into whispers about his delusions off it. His financial records showed mounting debt, unpaid taxes, and several declined credit applications. Elric was living well beyond his means, clinging to a lifestyle he could no longer afford: luxury clothes, fine dining, and expensive props for roles that didn't pay. What kept him afloat, investigators discovered, was Naela. Her bookstore wasn't just a charming local business. It was a profitable one. Her meticulous bookkeeping, strong customer base, and smart investments in rare books brought in steady income. But more importantly, Naela had 2 life insurance policies in her name, both of which named Elric as the sole beneficiary. The total payout, just over $800,000. That revelation raised immediate alarms. Detectives dug deeper and uncovered another crucial piece of information. Just 2 months before her death, Naela had begun meeting with a lawyer to quietly amend her will. The changes would leave the bulk of her assets, including the bookstore and a savings account, to her sister, Vera, instead of Elric. At the time of her death, the updated will hadn't been finalized, but drafts had already been completed and emails exchanged with her attorney. It became clear that Naela had been preparing to separate her life from Elric's, financially and emotionally. According to Vera, Naela had grown distant from her husband over the past year. She had spoken of feeling used, not physically abused, but emotionally manipulated, as if she were merely a supporting character in Elric's endless one-man play. She confided that she no longer felt safe, though she never elaborated on what that meant. Her sister urged her to leave, to seek help, but Naela insisted she needed time. She wanted to untangle her finances and make a clean break, for herself, and the business she had built. Elric, investigators believed, had found out. Whether he discovered the will or sensed her drifting away, the fear of losing control and losing access to her money likely pushed him to act. If she left him, his debts would swallow him. If she changed the will, he would gain nothing from her death. But if he acted quickly, before anything changed, he could secure a financial escape plan and maintain the image of a devoted husband shattered by tragedy. The theory was chilling, but it fit too well with everything else. The staged grief, the inconsistencies in his alibi, the pre-written script, all signs pointed to a man who saw his wife not as a partner, but as a final opportunity to solve the disaster of his own life. The fact that the murder weapon was never found no longer mattered. The motive was clear, and the story Elric had tried so hard to write was beginning to collapse under the weight of the truth. By the time the insurance companies were alerted to the ongoing investigation, they had already frozen the payout. Elric, now facing mounting suspicion and public scrutiny, remained outwardly calm. He gave one final interview to a local reporter, still insisting he was innocent. But behind the sorrow in his eyes, there was no longer the glimmer of performance, only the cold realization that the final act was drawing near. The trial of Elric Moreau became the most talked-about event Aldridge Falls had ever seen. News trucks lined the courthouse lawn, their satellite dishes angled like vultures waiting for a signal. Journalists from neighboring states descended. On the quiet town, eager to cover the case of the charming, grieving husband now accused of murdering his wife for money and attention. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. Everyone wanted to see whether the man who had spent his life pretending could finally be unmasked. Elric entered the courtroom each day with the same calm expression, dressed in somber suits, carrying the aura of a man wrongfully accused. He sat upright, never fidgeted, and occasionally closed his eyes, as if bracing himself against the cruelty of a world that didn't understand him. But for all his composure, the prosecution had come armed with the kind of evidence that was difficult to cry away. They opened with the script. Jurors were handed copies of the notebook found in the abandoned theater. The prosecutor read passages aloud, slowly, letting each word settle. She emphasized the staged grief, the pre-written 911 lines, the notes about practicing tears. Faces in the jury box hardened. The defense objected, claiming the notebook was simply a piece of fiction, creative writing taken out of context. But when a handwriting analyst confirmed the script was written by Elric, and when the timeline matched the exact night of Naela's death, it was clear this was no mere artistic exercise. Witnesses followed, each one adding another thread to the unraveling image Elric had tried to preserve. The baristas from the cafe testified that he had not been there the night of the murder. A theater colleague confirmed Elric left rehearsal unusually early and seemed distracted. Forensic experts explained how Naela had no defensive wounds, supporting the theory she had been taken by surprise, possibly from someone she trusted. Then came the financial motive. Bank statements showed Elric was drowning in debt. The insurance agent testified about the two policies, both in Elric's name, and how they had only recently been updated. Naela's attorney presented email exchanges showing she had intended to change her will, a change that, had it been finalized in time, would have cut Elric out entirely. The defense struggled to counter the weight of the evidence. They leaned heavily on Elric's lack of a criminal record, his public devotion to Naela, and the absence of the murder weapon. They claimed the timeline discrepancies were human error, that grief distorted memory. They framed the script as a therapeutic exercise, written by a man dealing with emotional pain through art, but the jury didn't buy it. When Elric chose to take the stand, it was a gamble. He spoke with elegance and restraint, describing his love for Naela, their shared dreams, and his sorrow. He admitted to writing the script, but claimed it was written after her death, a way to process his trauma. Yet the prosecution played a clip from his earlier interview where he had denied ever writing such a thing. The contradiction cut through the courtroom like a blade. After 5 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Elric showed no visible reaction, no tears, no anger, just silence. The same silence Naela had faced on that final night, in the living room surrounded by books and shadows. The bookstore was eventually passed to Vera, who reopened it 6 months later under a new name, Naela's Light. The shop remained much the same: soft lighting, creaky floors, the scent of lavender in the air. But now, in the back corner where author readings used to take place, sat a small framed photo of Naela. Above it, a quote etched in brass read, "Truth, unlike fiction, cannot be rehearsed." Elric Moreau was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He no longer had an audience, no stage, no applause. His final performance, crafted with the precision of a master actor, had ended not in ovation, but in a cold, empty silence.